The fire that burned City Hall on Kennedy Street in November of 1901 nearly destroyed the building. It killed 38 horses in a neighboring livery stable and burned the entire city block from Boylston to Main Street. The building was only 3 years old and was a beautiful example of Victorian municipal architecture. The fire, which began in the early morning hours on November 8th, 1901, was certainly the most exciting and probably the most disastrous fire that Bradford had ever seen. Join us for this week's Coffee with the Curator as we look at the 1901 fire that burned City Hall. City Hall was designed by this man, Enoch Curtis of Fredonia, New York. He's a little studied regional architect who designed more than 60 buildings in western New York and northeastern Pennsylvania. And it is said he epitomizes the carpenter who turned architect merely by reading about it. Curtis was born in 1831 and had been in the Civil War when he was wounded at the Battle of Cold Harbor. He reached the rank of major, and after the Civil War he returned to New York State and began designing local buildings. He was chosen as the architect of Bradford's new City Hall on March 23rd of 1897, and by April, bids went out to the local contractors to find someone to build it. Here's a photograph of City Hall nearly completed. If you look carefully near the front door on Kennedy Street, you can see a ladder leaning against the entrance. This photograph was taken from a book published in 1898 called The Artwork of McKean County. I am sure the editors of that book wanted to make sure to include the photograph of the new City Hall, even though it wasn't quite finished yet. And you may say to yourself, hey, wait a minute, that clock tower doesn't look right. There's no clock. And you'd be right. That tower burned during the fire of 1901, and there won't be a clock in that tower until 1935. The fire began here at Frank Beamer's livery stable, which was located next to City Hall on Kennedy Street. Flames were first discovered by a night operator of the National Transit Company, a man called George Hendrickson, who set out the alarm. A lot of valuable time was wasted as the flames were spreading like lightning through the wooden building. It seemed to act as a chimney, and 3 minutes after the alarm was given, it was impossible to make any attempt to rescue the 38 horses who were imprisoned inside. The sound of horses as they were burned alive must have been terrible. One horse was saved, though. Years ago, Harvey Phillips, a local businessman and historian, told me a story about the night of the fire. His father, David Phillips, lived on Jackson Avenue, and he could see the smoke from his house and see the flames. His prize racehorse, called Bay Simmons, was in Beamer's livery stables. And panicked, he ran from his house all the way down Kennedy Street to the fire. When he got there, he could hear the horses burning alive inside and shouted, "I'll give a $20 gold piece to anyone who saves my horse." Immediately, a 29-year-old Bradford policeman named Nathan Case took him up on his offer and immediately ran into the burning barn and saved the horse, leading it to safety. It was the only horse to survive. Among the 38 horses that died in the fire were a racehorse named Molly Pitcher, valued at $700, an important coach horse named Prince of India, valued at $500, Pete, the old war horse owned by Dr. Johnson, the Wells Fargo Express Company's team killed by falling timbers, and Cook's undertaking company Hearst Horses. Frank Bieber, who lived up over the stable and who had escaped the fire wearing only the clothes on his back, said, "The money loss is only a secondary matter. I will stand for that and hope to get a new start. But the thought that so many splendid horses, the noblest of creatures next to man, should perish there in a prison of fire is simply horrible." This is a photograph of City Hall, probably taken in the afternoon of the fire. Remember, it started at 4 a.m., and by this afternoon they were pouring water on just to cool it down. The photographer was probably standing in front of the Hill Memorial Church across the street. It was November, and there was a brisk wind and steady rainfall that morning, but the fire had spread quickly. The Bradford era reported the flames rolled high in vast outbursts and illuminated the entire town. It was not long before thousands of people witnessed the most destructive fire in the town's history. Here is a map that shows the extent of the fire. It's an old Sanborn map from 1899 and is actually pretty accurate. The map at left shows the area between Boylston Street and Main Street before the fire. The map on the right shows the buildings that were burned in red. The orange shows the buildings that were damaged to some degree but not completely destroyed. The exact cause of the fire was never known. It was said the wind at times swept across the fire-stricken district with considerable force, and the flames leaped from building to building with amazing rapidity. Flying embers were blown hundreds of feet, and fully 20 houses were on fire. It helps to understand the tragedy if you know what buildings were involved and who was involved. Number 1 on this map is Beamer's livery stable, where the fire first started. On the previous photograph in this video, it looks like it's made of brick, but that's only the front on Kennedy Street. It's actually made completely of wood, and you can see on this map that it's an L-shaped building, quite large. Now, Frank Beamer and other people lived upstairs when the fire started. They lost everything. Number 2 on this map is a brick building, which was owned by a man named DeGolia. Alder's Meat Market was located downstairs, and a woman named Mary Thomas lived upstairs. The loss on the building was valued at $7,000, and there was a $1,000 insurance. Building number 3 was owned by George Anderson, who owned a sewing machine company on the ground floor. During the fire, helpful men on the street ran in and helped him remove most of his sewing machine equipment and put it out on Kennedy Street. Later, when he went to reclaim that equipment, he found that some of his sewing machine stuff had been stolen. Human nature, folks. A young woman named Marie Williams lived upstairs over the shop. She was trapped by the fire and was forced to jump from the second-story window into a blanket held by men on the street. She survived. A restaurant owned by Mrs. Jane Marshall and a dry goods store owned by B. Jacobson were building number 4. Marshall managed to save most of her stock, but Jacobson lost everything. The 2 people who lived upstairs of the building escaped, but saved nothing. Building number 5 was Hong Wa's Chinese Laundry and J.W. Fritz's music store. The building burned so quickly that nothing could be saved. Building number 6 is Conrad Wagner's harness shop. Wagner saved most of his harness stock, but the people who lived upstairs lost everything. And building number 7 was the laundry that belonged to the Hotel Weaver. It could not be saved. And here's a photograph of the devastation of the fire, probably taken the next day or even a couple days later. That brick building you see in the middle of the photograph is what's left of Alder's Meat Market. You can see City Hall in the background, and surrounding it, all the burned buildings. Coffin's Livery Stable, located behind City Hall on Boylston Street, and seen here highlighted in sort of a pale orange color, is the largest livery stable in the city in 1901. It had 100 horses, and they all survived. It caught fire almost immediately, but dozens of men ran into the barn to save the horses. They tried to drive the horses down Patton Alley to Main Street, but the horses kept running back into the barn. Finally, several young men actually tore down one of the walls on the east side of the livery stable and managed to drive the horses out onto Boylston Street and then down Bishop Street. Surprisingly, even though nearly 1,000 people were lining the street, no one was hurt by the horses running through the streets. All were saved, as well as most of the carriages, sleighs, buggies, and wagons that had been stored inside. Coffin's Livery Stable will rebuild eventually on Barber Street, but will burn again in 1924. The Star Garage will then be built on that site. The burned property on Boylston Street was sold eventually to Solomon Dresser following the fire, and he built a new Dresser office building here in 1904. That office building is still standing, and today is number 54 Boylston. But what was happening to City Hall itself? The building was on fire almost immediately, 15 minutes after the alarm had been raised. The flames were streaming above the tower on City Hall, making a beautiful but awe-inspiring sight. The firemen had been concentrating on keeping the fire from spreading to more buildings, but at 5 o'clock they turned their attention to City Hall, which was a mass of flames. At 5 o'clock the tower fell in, and it seemed that the City Hall would be a loss. A little while later, the cornice fell from the roof on the north side of the building, burying 3 of the firemen who were on a ladder underneath the debris. It was feared they were killed, but they were extradited, a little worse for their experience. Another fireman suffered a broken leg when the pressure of the water hose flung him against another building. After the fire, the building was considered almost a complete loss, with only the bare walls standing to mark what had been the pride of the city. There was only $22,000 insurance. The Bradford era wrote, "Bradford City Hall is a smoldering pile of ruins." Many valuable records, of course, were lost in the fire. In the city engineers department, the maps and registers were burned, but the water department saved its official documents, books, and maps. The city controller's books and documents were saved, and so were those of the city treasurer. City solicitor Schoonmaker and lawyer William Wallace Brown were among the heaviest losers in the fire. Their valuable library on the second floor was a complete loss. Every volume and many valuable records and papers were destroyed. Their estimated loss was $5,000. The next day, the Bradford Era wrote, "Bradford people were dazed yesterday morning when the darkness was dispelled, revealing the ravages of the fire which had proved so disastrous to private property owners and the municipality. The burnt district had been literally deluged with water for 3 hours, and great clouds of steam and smoke arose over the ruins of the structures that had been destroyed in the section bounded by Kennedy and Boylston and Patton Place. Crowds of men and women were drawn to the place by the spectacle, and all were much depressed by what they witnessed. All day the streets adjacent to the charred and blackened waste were crowded. Ropes had been stretched to keep people away from the city building. It was feared that the lofty tower, which stood out grimly over the wrecked and ruined structure, would fall, but it still stands, a gruesome reminder of one of the worst fires in Bradford history." Of course, there was no question that City Hall would be rebuilt. Bradfordians loved City Hall, and it was almost immediately decided to move the offices across the street on Main Street to the Orheim building, which many of you know now as the old Forest Oil building on the corner of Chestnut and Main. Enoch Curtis, the original architect of the building, was called down from Fredonia. He came on Christmas Eve and immediately drew up plans for the restoration of City Hall. Work continued all the next year through 1902, but by December 16th of 1902, City Council moved back into City Hall for the first meeting since the disastrous fire of November 8th of 1901, and would remain here for the next 60 years. But in 1962, city offices were moved to Main Street, and this City Hall would stay empty for over 40 years. But that's another story.